Hello, everybody. This is the new long, boring conversation with Drew series, also known as the soon-to-be discontinued long, boring conversation with Drew series. This is not a concise, to-the-point type video. This is a long, boring conversation with Drew. So if you have a short attention span and you need like rockin' music in the background with short explanations that are simple and easy, really, now is a great time to move along to something else because this is the opposite of that. This is a morning conversation with Drew over his coffee, and it's really boring and it's long, and he gets technical and tries to cover way too much information in a long conversation. So you have been warned. This is not exciting stuff, so please heed this warning. If you need short attention span stuff, move along. And for the rest of you, you have been warned. Welcome to the long, boring conversation series with Drew. Hello, everyone. Drew here with the DREWnetwork, coming to you minutes from bed with my very first cup of coffee. This is part 2 of this lens conversation. If you haven't seen part 1, please go and watch that first, because all of this builds on top of each other. All the disclaimers, all the notes, everything mentioned in part 1 apply to this, and there will probably be a part 3, but I'm hoping that will be the end of it. Worst case scenario, there will be a part 4. I am kind of in a rush this morning, so I'm going to try to cover 2 major concepts that really are critical to doing an introduction to lenses. First, let's start off with the concepts of what the number 24 millimeter means, what the number 50 millimeter means, what the number 100 millimeter means. Lenses are measured by their focal length. And again, as I described in part 1 of this series, I'm not going to bore you with equations. I'm simply going to try to associate what the numbers mean. And if this stuff is interesting to you, then there's a lot more to learn about everything, and it can take you years or months at least. So let's start off by looking at images from, these are full frame equivalents, and that's how things are measured in a general context these days, so we're just going to go with that. You should be looking at 24 millimeter equivalent. That's the 24 millimeter. Now we're going to look at the exact same scene at a 50 millimeter equivalent. That's what it looks like at 50 millimeter. And next, we're going to look at the exact same scene at an 85 millimeter equivalent. 85 millimeter equivalent. I'll just dump the word equivalent. Now you're looking at an 85 millimeter scene. So, what's the difference? The magic number that you want to start to understand is the number 50. 50 millimeter. And that's pretty damn simple, because if you think 50%, 50% is right in the middle. 50 millimeter is what's called normal. Anything below 50 millimeter is called wide. Anything beyond 50 millimeter is called telephoto. It's a long shot, long end. Telephoto shot. So these are the big major concept you want to understand is 50 millimeter is called normal. In theory, 50 millimeter represents what the human eye sees. That's the theory. If we want to argue technical stuff, I would probably argue that 85 millimeter. But for a general introductory concept, 50 millimeter is called a normal lens. That's supposed to be normal. Anything below 50 millimeter is a wide angle lens. Anything above 50 millimeter is telephoto. So, if I want to take a shot of a landscape, what do you think? We want something below 50 millimeter, or something 35 millimeter, maybe a 28 millimeter, maybe a 24 millimeter, and the lower that number is going, the wider the picture is going. So a 24 millimeter lens, that's a pretty shockingly wide angle lens. 35 millimeter is less wide angle than a 24 millimeter certainly, and it's obviously wider than a 50 millimeter. Remember, the magic number is 50. 50 millimeter is the normal lens. So if we want to start going further than 50 millimeter, Let's go for a 85 millimeter lens. That obviously is more telephoto than a normal, than the 50 millimeter. And with that in mind, now let's take a look at the three scenes. What is it? Here we go. Now let's look at, what is it, 24 millimeter. That's 24 millimeter. Now let's go to 50 millimeter. Now let's go to 85 millimeter. And now let's take that, let's go to 160 millimeters. So now you're looking at the 160 millimeters. So as you can see, the higher we go, the further the telephoto, the more the telephoto, the further the zoom. So for example, knowing what you know now, then a 100 millimeter lens, well, that would be a telephoto lens, right? If you saw a lens that said it was 70 to 200 millimeter, that would be a variable focal length and or a zoom that I spent the last episode condemning. They exist, 70 to 200 millimeter. I own one. It cost a fortune. And I won't get into that, but that's a zoom. That's if you're trying to capture images from far away. So, right now I'm talking to you at this very instant through an 85 millimeter lens. You'll notice the camera is further away. You'll notice the background is blurry. Next we'll get into, I'm going to spend like 2 sentences talking about a very, very complex concept: deep focus and shallow focus. Let's look at deep focus. This is a deep focus shot. Everything from corner to corner is in focus. You're probably not paying attention to the subject, which is me. That's called deep focus, corner to corner sharpness. Now let's look at shallow focus. If we're looking at the shallow focus, you will see I am in focus. The background is out of focus. And what does that do? That directs the attention of you, the viewer. That's what that does. So that's how professionals use that. If we had a shot of a crowded cafe, for example, and your subject is sitting there in the foreground, and then sitting behind your subject is a gorgeous, hot woman, you know, with a low-cut t-shirt or whatever. Where do you think, if you're using deep focus, corner to corner, everything in that shot is in focus, what do you think your viewers are going to be looking at? Are they going to be looking at your subject, or are they going to be looking at the woman in the background? On the flip, so in a situation like that, you use shallow focus. You are directing your viewer's attention to what you want your viewer to be paying attention to. Shallow focus means that the hot woman with a low-cut t-shirt in the background would be nothing but a blurred-out blob, sort of like what the background is right now here in this shot that I'm speaking to you with. Finally, I'm going to close conversation too, discussing the concept of aperture. Aperture, the word means hole, and basically you have lenses with big holes and you have lenses with little teeny tiny holes. Let's look at a picture on the screen. Maybe you already are looking at it. The lens on the left is a 50 millimeter prime. 50 millimeter we talked about earlier, so that's a normal lens. That's right in the middle. That's not telephoto, that's not wide angle, that's a normal lens. And you'll notice it has a big hole. That's called an aperture. Big aperture. In the previous version of this video I said big ass hole, meaning, you know, big ass and then the word hole. But obviously that doesn't work, does it? So let's call it a big ass aperture. Look at the lens on the left, big ass aperture. Lens on the right, little teeny tiny aperture. What does that mean? The lens with the big hole on the left, lots of light passes through that big hole. Lots of light passes through that lens, hitting your sensor. In the old days it hit film, now it hits the sensor. The lens on the right, little teeny tiny hole. Less light passes through the little teeny tiny hole, hitting the sensor. That has a smaller aperture. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is really the introduction, the beginning concept to how you understand what a quality lens is and what a piece of shit lens is. The lens on the left is a large aperture prime lens. Lots of light passes through it. Now, what does lots of light passes through it mean? Let's imagine you're in a relatively dark room. The lighting is kind of crappy and you're in a relatively dark room. Which of those two lenses do you think you want to use? If the lighting is crappy, You want a lens with a lot of light passing through the big hole. If the lighting is bad, obviously a lot less light is going to pass through the little teeny tiny hole to hit the sensor. And so this is the concept of aperture. Quality lenses have bigger holes. I'm generalizing, as again, all the disclaimers in the first video, but I'm just introducing you to the concept. All of this topics you can learn about more for years and years and years, so don't write me telling me I'm generalizing. Quality lenses have a big hole. Cheapo lenses, little hole, less glass, they're cheaper, little hole. The lens on the left is an f measured. It's called an f1.4. That means when it's wide open, the big hole is measured at f/1.4. There's an equation for that, which I'm not going to bore you with. But the concept is that the lower the number, the bigger the hole. So, for an example, the lens on the left is f1.4. The lens on the right is wide open at f3.5. So 1.4 is a lower number. The lower the number, the closer to 0, the bigger the hole. If you remember, 0 looks like a hole. The closer to 0, the bigger the hole. I'm grasping at straws here, but hopefully that will help some of you. The closer to 0, the bigger the hole. So the lens on the left is f1.4. The lens on the left is f3.5. Some of these Canon L zoom lenses that cost a fortune, quite a few of them, I think, their widest aperture is f4. f4. So then the question raises, which would you rather have? Would you rather have an f4 lens, or would you rather have a lens that looks like that one on the left that's rated at f1.4? If you go to KEH.com, which is the most reputable used lens dealer in the United States, I trust them unconditionally. I buy all of my used lenses at KEH. If I wish I had a deal with them where I was getting a kickback, I'm not. I'm telling you the truth. I make no money by recommending these guys to you. But if I can figure out how to, I certainly will. But I use KEH.com. And if you go to KEH.com and if you go into the Nikon section, 35 millimeter, and then Nikon manual focus, and then you click on Nikon manual focus, and then you click on fixed focal length lenses. And if you scroll down through the list, maybe on bottom of page 1 or page 2, you will get into the 50 millimeter range of lenses. Again, going back to what we covered earlier, 50 is normal, 50 right in the middle. Anything below 50, like a 35 millimeter or a 28 millimeter, that's a wide angle lens. Anything above 50, like an 85 millimeter or a 100 millimeter or a 200 millimeter, those are all telephoto lenses, where you look at things from afar. They zoom in on something. So if you go there and you scroll down and you get into the 50 millimeter range of lenses, you will see that there's a 50 millimeter f1.2, and that lens costs about $1,000. And then a little bit further down, there's a 50 millimeter f1.4, like the one you saw in that picture. And those are in the $500 range roughly. And then if you continue scrolling down, you'll see 50 millimeter f1.8. Again, remember, we're moving away from 0 further up, so that we're getting smaller as we move away from 0, the big hole. So at f1.8, those lenses, you can get those between $100 and $300. And then at the bottom of the 50 millimeter range, you'll find 50 millimeter f2. And those you can buy for about $60. So, thinking about everything in theory that we've covered in this conversation so far, why then is a 50 millimeter f1.2 lens cost $1,000? And the same 50 millimeter lens rated at f1.4 costs about $500. And then the same 50 millimeter, same normal lens, but rated at f1.8, you can get those between, say, $100 and $300. And then the same 50 millimeter lens range rated at f2, you can pick those up for $60. Why? Because the number, as we move away from the big 0, as we move up, f1.2, f1.4, f1.8, f2, as we move up, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller holes. We're moving away from the big hole, and we're moving down to smaller holes. Smaller holes means less light passes through the lens, hitting your sensor. And again, what does that mean? Well, that means a whole bunch of things. So understanding that the hole is getting smaller, the less light is passing through the lens. So in theory, in a generalizing sense, the quality of the lens is decreasing. And that's the f-stop measurement of a lens. That's the measurement at when the lens is wide open. Yeah, and that's how lenses are rated. So let's look at that picture again. The lens on the right, that's the kit lens for the Panasonic GH2, the 14 to 42 millimeter one. That one is rated what? f3.5 to f5.6. So f5.6, that's pretty far away from f1.4 as the lens on the left. Those are what your zoom lenses tend to be rated at, whereas your quality primes tend to be rated anywhere from f1.4 up to f2. Right now I'm coming to you through an 85 millimeter f2 lens. This is a Nikkor AIS lens. Now, this 85 millimeter is a little bit different, so f2 for an 85 millimeter isn't as bad as f2 on a 50 millimeter, but again, I'm getting complex. So, in theory, and I've got to go now in a few minutes, in theory, we have covered two major concepts that are, in theory, a terribly helpful introduction to people getting started with lenses, here in part 2 of this conversation. Concept 1 that we covered is what do the focal lengths mean? How do you know if a lens is a wide-angle lens or a telephoto lens? And we begin with the magic number 50 millimeter. And remember, the memory association with that is 50%, which is right in the middle of 100. 50 millimeter is normal. Anything below 50 millimeter is a wider angle lens, and the further down you go, the wider it gets. I think Nikon, the widest lens, I think now I'm doing this from memory, I could be wrong, but I think the widest non-fisheye wide-angle Nikon ever made was, I think a 15 millimeter. And that's pretty far away from 50. That's pretty damn wide. That's weird wide. Fisheye is that extreme wide thing where everything looks super rounded. That's what you see like kids using filming skateboard videos use. And the reason they do is because the wider the lens, the more stable the motion's going to look. But I'm not, again, that's conversation 15 that will never be filmed. So in any event, so the lower from 50 that's a wide angle lens, above 50 is telephoto. And then that's the major concept number 1 we've covered. And then major concept number 2 is the f-stop rating. The lower the f-stop number, the better, the bigger the hole, the more light that passes through the lens, the better the lens. If you need a lens that you need to film in a dark situation, then you use something with a big hole, like an f1.4. On the other hand, if you're standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert at noon with the sun above you and you're being blinded and you need super sunglasses to see, in that situation, a little teeny tiny hole will work just fine. And that's why your cheaper consumer lenses are fine if you're filming people at the beach with the little hole. They work quite nicely, in the middle of the sun. But they look like shit when you go into a dark room and then you need a flash or you need to add lots and lots of light. I will close with one final concept. In the first episode, I talked about the zoom and how I hate variable focal length lenses. The issue is that the further the zoom range, the lower the quality. So, for example, there's that Tokina. I think it's 11 to 15. Is that right? Is it 11 to 16 millimeter? It's something like that. 11 to 16 millimeter, that's a pretty low range of zoom, in other words, of variable focal length. So you're not paying as dearly with the image quality with something with a smaller range. The kit lens that comes with the Panasonic GH2, which is a 14 to 42 millimeter. That's kind of as far as you want to push it, and that's still a crappy lens. And I say that with love. I mean, you can use it, and it has uses, and it has been useful, and I've used it on serious real-world productions. And if you know how to use it, you can create professional results. But it's not an f1.4 lens. But again, that's kind of a medium zoom range. Then, and here's the point of this conversation, then you have what are called the super zoom lenses. And some of these cost a frickin' fortune. And I'll pick specifically on the Panasonic 14 to 140 millimeter lens. Now, if you remember what we talked about in the opening part of this conversation, how long have I been talking now? If you remember what we talked about in the opening part of this conversation, and then you hear the numbers, this lens goes from 14 millimeter to 140 millimeter. That's a lens that seems like it covers everything in the frickin' universe. One lens, and my God, that's the entire range. Those are called super zoom lenses, folks, and for that convenience, you are paying so dearly. When you've got a range that big, the distortion on the wide end is extreme. Some of these cameras have built-in distortion corrections, but you don't rely on that shit. That's still early in that technology development. And then when you go to the long end, it's pincushion from hell, and it's not necessarily flattering pincushion. So the longer the variable focal length, the longer the zoom range, again, the crappier the lens, the more you're paying for the image quality. So for example, the Nikon 17 to 35 millimeter, what is that? It's not a G lens, that's the D, right? AFD, Nikon 75 to 35 millimeter, I believe it's f3 point. Anyway, 17 to 35. You know, that's not an extreme zoom, so that's not going to have as extreme the distortion as you know, a 14 to 140 millimeter. And like the Tokina 11 to 16, and I could be getting those numbers wrong. I think that's about right. That's kind of a smaller zoom range. So you're getting less of the problems associated with variable focal length. And in conclusion, that's the reason why when I'm given the choice between buying the kit lens, I was given the choice between a 14 to 140 millimeter kit lens for a Panasonic GH2 or a cheaper 14 to 42 millimeter. Without one second thought, I selected the 14 to 42 millimeter because the distortion is going to be vastly less than the 14 to 140 millimeter. So I'm out of time, guys. This has been conversation 2. I assume there will be a conversation 3, and all the disclaimers in part 1 apply to this and part 3. But in theory, we have covered 2 very major key concepts that will help all of you throughout the rest of your life who are interested in this and who this video is appropriate for, people getting started. Number 1, how do we measure lenses? Below 50 is wide, above 50 is telephoto, and number 2 is the f-stops. The closer to 0, the bigger the hole. f1.4 has a big hole, f1.2 has an even bigger hole. f5.6 has a little teeny tiny hole. Big hole, lots of light passes through. Little teeny tiny hole, less light passes through. Your better quality lenses on a range of levels have bigger holes and more light passes through. This has been, first of all, finally, in conclusion, if I didn't say this at the very beginning, I thank everybody for all those kind comments on episode 1. The kind comments confuses Drew. Thank you to all of you. It's appreciated, and I thank you, each and every one of you who wrote those nice things on conversation 1. This is conversation 2, and this is Drew wishing you well and signing off, and I'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.